Hello, boys. Hello, girls. Hello, babes. Welcome back to the Jenaya Talks Caps podcast off-season edition, as we had some huge off-season news for our Washington Capitals last week, as General Manager Brian McClellan, moving and shaking, he announces that he's not only offloaded Darcy Kuemper's contract from the Capitals books, but also that in doing so, he has also acquired former third overall pick, 25-year-old centerman Pierre-Luc Dubois from the Los Angeles Kings in a trade that I really think has potential to pay dividends for both sides. So we will get into all of that. But first, as always, babes, I just wanted to thank you all so much for tuning in today during your summer vacation, no less, away from the rink. Everybody pretty much, is doing other things right now. Not so much focused on hockey, on the Washington Capitals during the off season, right? But we're coming up now to, the Stanley Cup final has just wrapped up. We're coming up now to the draft, to the beginning of free agency. And so things really starting to move along here. So, we're going to have a lot of content coming up. It means a lot to me that, you guys, even during your summer vacation, that you still want to be here, still want to be tuning in, still want to be listening to what we have to say about our favorite team, the Washington Capitals. And as always, we would like to invite you, if you have not already done so, to please go ahead and subscribe to our podcast if you do enjoy your time here. Whether you're a longtime listener or whether you're brand new to our show and this is your first time listening because you just want the Pierre-Luc Dubois tea, we appreciate each and every single one of our listeners just the same. And so we would love to have you along here with us for every single episode, which is why we would love it if you would click on that subscribe button. Become a part of our Caps family here, and let's talk some Washington Capitals hockey, baby. The tea is on, and it is piping hot. Pierre-Luc Dubois. This trade, my oh my. Not a lot of people, I don't think, saw this one coming, at least not, in the mainstream media. So first off, let's make sure that everyone knows exactly what the trade itself was, the logistics of it for anyone who may not have heard. So the trade was 1-for-1. Darcy Kuemper for Pierre-Luc Dubois. Darcy Kuemper, of course, he had been relegated to the role of backup goalie for the Capitals due to both his poor play combined with the emergence and stellar play of Charlie Lindgren. So Darcy Kuemper had, and still has, just now it's for the Los Angeles Kings, a salary cap hit of $5.25 million for the next 3 seasons still, and he is 34 years old. Pierre-Luc Dubois, on the other hand, he is 25 years old. He has 7 seasons remaining on a contract that pays him $8.5 million annually. So for the Caps, it is about a $3 million jump in their salary cap, but I'm going to tell you in a minute why that doesn't really matter, because there's really 3 parts to this thing, right? So there's the effect on the Capitals salary cap, which we will get into. I will talk about that. There's the player himself and what he brings on the ice, and obviously we will get into that here as well. And then there's also this perceived, attitude problem or locker room problem that comes along with any conversation about Pierre-Luc Dubois. So we are going to get into all 3 of these things here today. And let's start off first with that salary cap picture for the Washington Capitals. First off, let's just state the obvious right off the bat here. Our Washington Capitals, thankfully, are not one of the NHL teams currently facing salary cap trouble. If you've looked at the Washington Capitals salary cap picture anytime recently, their salary cap, thankfully, like I said, is in a pretty good way right now. It's in pretty good shape, given the fact that they are in a bit of a rebuilding phase here, which makes it all the more impressive that they managed to claw their way into the Stanley Cup playoffs this past season. And they have several young, inexpensive players on their roster, as well as the fact that they have done very well, to hand out some pretty team-friendly contracts recently, such as, the aforementioned 5-year contract extension to the team's leading scorer, Dylan Strome. not aforementioned, I guess. I hadn't talked about it yet during this episode, but we have talked about it before. But yeah, that 5-year contract extension handed out to Dylan Strome. He was, of course, the team's leading scorer this season, so that contract looking very much like a bargain. There's been some other very team-friendly contracts handed out as well on the back end, right? Most recently, Rasmus Sandin, Martin Feravari as well just before him. So they have a lot of their, kind of younger core guys locked up to these very team-friendly deals. And that's really helping their salary cap picture as well. Like I said, as all of these, there's more and more young players for the Capitals right now coming up through the system. And all of those young players, of course, are going to be very inexpensive for the first few seasons, at least, of their career. So a lot of good moves made by the Caps in terms of, locking up their own young depth to team-friendly contracts. And the fact that their salary cap picture, was already in good shape, combined with the fact that the NHL has now announced that the salary cap ceiling for the league as a whole will rise by $4.5 million for next season. So that is going from $83.5 million this past season to $88 million for next season. So all of these things, right, all of this means that our Washington Capitals have a lot of money to play with right now and into their future as well, which is obviously a very, very good thing. That goes without saying. And for what it's worth, like the NHL's salary cap ceiling is also expected to continue to rise by $4 to $5 million every season now for at least the next few seasons after this one, as the NHL's salary cap plays catch up after the coronavirus pandemic. So that is great too, obviously. But as mentioned, the Caps already have plenty of room to play with right now. So they don't need to wait for the cap to go up more before making moves to improve their team. And as it stands right now, even after acquiring Pierre-Luc Dubois, the Caps still have approximately $13 million to play with for next season, while having only a couple of their own roster players still left to re-sign, those being restricted free agents, Connor McMichael and Beck Malenstein, who are still obviously quite young and therefore should not cost a lot. And when you look beyond next season, the Caps salary cap picture somehow looks even better, if that's possible. As don't forget, like they have that $13 million to play with for next season, right? And that's even whilst having half of Evgeny Kuznetsov's salary cap charge still on their books for next season. But that'll be gone after this next season, as will the $2 million performance bonus that they owe to Max Pacioretty on this upcoming season's books. So those are two, we call them dead cap hits or dead money. Those are two things that will not be on the Washington Capitals books after this upcoming season. But for now, they're there and they have already been included in that $13 million of salary cap space that the Capitals do have for this upcoming season. So that's about another $6 million in cap space that the Caps are going to magically acquire before next season. In addition to the NHL's salary cap ceiling likely rising another $4 to $5 million, as mentioned before. So are you starting to see why Pierre-Luc Dubois' cap hit is not going to be a problem here? Like, this is exactly the type of potentially very high reward move that the Caps should be making right now, as they have more than enough salary cap space to do so. And even when you look like longer term than just the next couple of seasons, after this upcoming season, Backstrom's contract is going to be off the books for good. God, that pains me to say. Oshie's contract is going to be off the books. That pains me to say as well. That retained cap hit for Kuznetsov as well, like I said, is going to be off the books. As is, like I said, that performance bonus owing to Max Pacioretty. And in just 2 seasons' time, Alex Ovechkin's contract and therefore his current cap hit of $9.5 million is going to expire. I know obviously no one likes to think about that, myself included for sure. And hey, there's nothing saying that he won't re-sign for another season or two before retiring, so we can hope for that. I'm sure at the end of that 2025-2026 season, when his contract is due to expire, there will definitely be some one more year chance going up inside of Capital One Arena, that is for sure. But yeah, even if he were to sign on for another season or two, it's not going to be at the $9.5 million that he's making now, right? So, and then you've also got John Carlson's $8 million, Nick Jensen's $4+ million, and Trevor Van Riemsdyk's $3 million, all coming off of the books at the same time that OV contract expires. So you're going to have a ton of flexibility in the upcoming years here as you shed a lot of these older big money contracts in favor of younger players. So the whole point of me telling you all of these numbers and laying all of this out for you guys is just to show that really, like, the way that this Pierre-Luc Dubois contract lines up with the timing of what's going to be a transition to a much younger, much less expensive roster, combined, like I said, with the fact that the NHL's salary cap ceiling is now on the rise, there's really no reason to stress a cap hit for Pierre-Luc Dubois if you're a Capitals fan, right? Because their salary cap situation is in such good shape. This is a far less risky move for the Capitals specifically than it would have been for one of the many teams around the league that are more cap strapped, right? So for the Caps, because they don't have to be worried about cap space, it's basically just, hey, you know what? If it works out, then we got a really fucking good player, and all we gave up was Darcy Kuemper. So it's not often that you get opportunities to trade for players of Pierre-Luc Dubois' potential, right? And certainly not without giving up something more than one of, frankly, the worst goaltenders in the entire NHL last season, right? So you're normally having to give up a lot more than that to get a player of Pierre-Luc Dubois' potential. So I like it a lot for the Caps. I like the thought process behind it. I think it's a good risk to take. It's really not much of a risk for the Capitals, like I said, because of their salary cap picture, because of their salary cap situation being in such good shape. So I like Brian McClellan getting creative and finding a way to get a top six forward without giving up a premium asset like a first rounder, or even worse, one of the Capitals' many promising young players and prospects, right? I love that he got this done without giving up anything like that. And I also love that he was able to obviously offload Darcy Kuemper's contract in the process. That's something that we know that they were looking to do. And so that difference in your salary cap isn't even that big of a difference when you really look at it, right? Like the difference between Pierre-Luc Dubois versus Darcy Kuemper, there's not much difference there cap hit wise. And at least there's a good chance that Pierre-Luc Dubois actually provides something of value out there on the ice. Darcy Kuemper at this point was a $5.25 million backup goalie who you couldn't even trust to put in the net or give him any starts whatsoever down the stretch. In my opinion, it was Darcy Kuemper's fault that Charlie Lindgren was so burned out by the time that we made it to the playoffs, because, Chucky couldn't get a night off at all down the stretch, at all. I'm talking for the last quarter of the regular season, he could not get a single night off because Kuemper was just so goddamn unreliable. And we needed every standings point that we could get. And so we could not afford to put him in the net, not even against the Anaheims or the Columbuses of the world, right? So I like the deal for the Caps. I think, like I said, it's a very high reward scenario when you talk about what Pierre-Luc Dubois can be. And I'll get into that in just a moment here. We'll talk about him as a player, on the ice. But yeah, the fact that you're able to unload Darcy Kuemper as well, the Caps goaltending next season, assuming that they call up one of the Hershey Bears' two stud goalies to be the backup to Lindgren, the Caps goaltending next season is only going to cost them less than $1.9 million against their salary cap. That's for both guys, whether it's Lindgren and Hunter Shepard or Lindgren and Clay Stevenson. Less than $1.9 million. That is absolutely fucking insane, you guys, especially considering that Charlie Lindgren was literally one of the very best goaltenders in the entire NHL last season. He's under contract at $1.1 million per season. It is no wonder that there were teams lined up around the block at the trade deadline to trade for his services. That is a very, very, very good contract. But yeah, so I've given you the full salary cap picture for the Washington Capitals now and how it pertains to Pierre-Luc Dubois and, taking on that contract of his. But I did also, like I said, want to talk a bit about the player himself, so that Caps fans who are listening to this can know what to expect, can know what they're getting when it comes to Pierre-Luc Dubois and his on-ice play. We will talk about the off-ice stuff as well, but first, his on-ice play. And listen, like I've watched the guy play quite a bit, probably more than most, and there is a ton of raw talent there. I mean, like he's big, he can skate like the wind, he's super, super skilled. He can beat guys one-on-one, he can shoot, he can score, he's got great vision and great playmaking ability. So in short, he's basically all of the things that any NHL team would want, right? I would say that the main issue for him has definitely been consistency. But I'm hoping that, just like we've already seen with other players here, that's something that Spencer Carberry and his coaching staff will be able to draw out of him, right? Pierre-Luc Dubois has spoken in the past about how he feels like he can be, and in fact, that he really wants to be, that consistently impactful player that his team can rely upon. And he has found it at times with different teams, not so much in Los Angeles, but certainly more so in Winnipeg and in Columbus before that. But yeah, like I've listened back to some of his past interviews now, which I'll talk about more later, but you can hear clearly in his interviews that there really does seem to be a very genuine desire to get better, to be more consistent. And in some of his interviews, it's almost as if he's almost like begging for direction, like begging for some coaching, right? So I'll talk about that. Like I said, I'll talk about it more later. But yeah, like I do think, frankly, that Spencer Carberry is going to be the perfect fit for that. And so therefore this marriage of Pierre-Luc Dubois with our Washington Capitals has the potential to be everything that both sides want. And stats-wise, I mean, like you can clearly see that this guy is a very good hockey player. Just 25 years old, as I mentioned, and yet he has already had 4 seasons with 20-plus goals, plus a 5th season where he was on pace for 20-plus. And most recently, throwing out his 1 season in Los Angeles and looking at his 2 most recent seasons with the Winnipeg Jets, he scored 28 goals in 81 games with Winnipeg in 2021-2022. And then he followed that up by scoring 27 goals in just 73 games in 2022-2023, a season in which he also put up 63 points in those 73 games. So overall, in his young career, he already has 3 60-plus point seasons. And as mentioned, it's no secret he had a down year last year in his 1 season with Los Angeles. And yet even in what was a down year for him, his 16 goals and 40 points last season still would have put him 3rd amongst Caps forwards in scoring last season, behind only Dylan Strome and Alex Ovechkin. So if the so-called worst season of a guy's career still has him 3rd on your team in scoring, that's probably exactly the type of trade that you make, right? Especially when all it costs you is Darcy Kuemper, who you were looking for a way to get rid of anyway, right? And I do also want to mention Pierre-Luc Dubois' past performances in the playoffs as well. Because I think it's worth mentioning, because playoff hockey, of course, is so different. Not everybody is built for it. And yet this guy has absolutely thrived in playoff series in the past against some really tough opponents. I'm speaking about, of course, the Columbus Blue Jackets versus the Tampa Bay Lightning in 2019. You may recall that Pierre-Luc Dubois' Blue Jackets swept the Lightning in what was a shocking upset at the time. The Lightning had just won the President's Trophy that season. They had set a ton of regular season records that season, and Pierre-Luc Dubois and his Columbus Blue Jackets came out there and swept them out of the playoffs. Pierre-Luc Dubois was absolutely the best player on the ice for either side. He was absolutely dominant on both sides of the puck. And then the very next season in the 2020 playoffs, he did the exact same thing to the Toronto Maple Leafs in what was another shocking upset and another instance of Pierre-Luc Dubois being the best player on the ice in a playoff series that featured some serious star power on the other side. So those 2 playoff series in particular, Blue Jackets versus Lightning and then Blue Jackets versus Maple Leafs. I'm mentioning these ones because I watched those 2 series very, very closely. And so I can tell you firsthand that Pierre-Luc Dubois was amazing in those series. When he was with the Winnipeg Jets, I didn't watch those ones as closely, so I won't comment too much on those. But I can see, just by looking at the stats that he was, again, at least pretty good in his last playoffs with Winnipeg, as he did put up 4 points in 5 games. a couple of goals as well against a very tough Vegas opponent who would obviously go on to win that season's Stanley Cup. And then, obviously his time in Los Angeles, like I said, as a member of the Kings, just did not go well. And that did include the playoffs where he scored just the 1 goal in a 5-game series loss to the Western Conference champion Edmonton Oilers. But the reason why I wanted to mention and, highlight the fact that Pierre-Luc Dubois' playoff performances have been largely positive, largely very strong performances by him, is because I think that really shows off what he's capable of when he's at his best, right? Is that he can be the best player on the ice in a playoff series that features, Nikita Kucherov, fumbling my words there, Nikita Kucherov, Braden Point, Steven Stamkos, or in one that features Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, Willie Nylander, right? Like Pierre-Luc Dubois was absolutely dummying these guys in the playoffs. And so I think if you're a Capitals fan, again, like you have a lot of reasons to be hyped up over the potential of this player, and also a lot of reasons to be optimistic that you will get the best version of this player now that we've got a coach like Spencer Carberry coaching him. Like, do we all remember what Anthony Mantha's play looked like pre-Spencer Carberry versus post-Spencer Carberry, right? Like, this is why I have a lot of faith here, folks. And so lastly, like, we are going to, like I said, have to touch on, briefly at least, the elephant in the room, if you will, in regards to Pierre-Luc Dubois and this perceived attitude problem that he supposedly has. And listen, like, he's picked up this reputation mainly, as far as I can tell, just because he's requested a trade a couple of different times. He requested a trade once when he was a member of the Columbus Blue Jackets, and then once when he was a member of the Winnipeg Jets. It wasn't so much that he requested a trade out of Winnipeg, but rather that he simply told the Jets that he wasn't going to be interested in re-signing there long term, which is his right, by the way, like just as it's every player's right. You don't have to sign anywhere that you don't want to be. And if you guys have ever been to Winnipeg during the hockey season, during the winter months, right? Winnipeg is not exactly the place that you want to be during the winter months, frankly, unless you have some sort of weird frostbite fetish, which evidently Pierre-Luc Dubois does not. But I can't blame the guy because I wouldn't want to live in Winnipeg during the winter months either. So anyways, let's chat for a second about why we maybe shouldn't be so quick to believe the negative hype surrounding Pierre-Luc Dubois, because I've seen just a ton of negativity coming out about this trade already. And the main thing that I want to put out there on my podcast right now is, like I said, don't be so quick to believe the negative hype. Things are not always as they seem, and let's give the guy a chance with our team before we judge him, right? Because the trade request thing, right? So like I said, the Winnipeg situation is a little bit different because he didn't actually, as far as I can tell, from everything that I've seen, he didn't actually request a trade. He just told them that he was not going to re-sign there long term, which is no different than like what Matthew Tkachuk did in Calgary, right? And people aren't shitting all over Matthew Tkachuk for that. So told Winnipeg that he didn't want to re-sign long term. He did request a trade, however, out of Columbus. So he's actually, as far as I can tell, only actually requested a trade one time, but people like to make it sound like it's been multiple times. But yeah, so like the wanting a trade thing, right? Like, okay, well, let's look at the places in which he's played that he wanted out from, right? Let's start there. So where has he been playing that he wanted out from? Oh, okay. So it's Columbus and Winnipeg that are the two that are in question here, right? So Columbus, which is in Ohio, and then Winnipeg, which is really just Canadian Ohio, right? So folks, like I would have a little more of an eyebrow raised and a little bit more of a concern about this if it were like, New York City and Florida that he was requesting trades from. But it's Columbus and Winnipeg. Okay, come on. Let's be real with ourselves here. Like if your boss comes in tomorrow morning and tells you, pack your shit, son, you're being transferred to the Winnipeg office. Are you going to be overly thrilled with that? Or are you going to be, counting down the days left on your contract until you can get the hell out of there? And it's not just the cities or the places themselves that I'm talking about here either, by the way, because it's more than just that. Like, it's also the hockey clubs themselves, the state of the team, the state of the locker room, the coaching staff. There's so many factors that go into it of, whether or not you want to play somewhere, of whether or not you want to sign on there for the long term and commit that many years of your career to a certain place, right? So let's take Columbus first, okay? So first of all, I'm just going to say it, seemingly every single player that has ever played for Columbus has requested a trade out of Columbus. So it's not as if Pierre-Luc Dubois is the only one. He's not a unicorn here in this regard, okay? Secondly, despite how badly the media seemed to want to create a rift between Pierre-Luc Dubois and his then head coach with the Blue Jackets, John Tortorella, Pierre-Luc Dubois' comments about Tortorella after having left Columbus were actually very positive and not suggestive of any rift between them at all. And besides, I honestly wouldn't blame Pierre-Luc Dubois even if there was a rift between him and Tortorella, as again, seemingly every player has a rift at some point between himself and John Tortorella. John Tortorella has rifts with everyone, okay? He could be having a conversation with Mother Teresa inside of a church and he'd find something to yell at her about, all right? And then moving on to Winnipeg, again, seemingly every single Jets player wanted out of Winnipeg during the time that Blake Wheeler was there. It's not unique to Pierre-Luc Dubois in terms of not wanting to be there. So I don't really understand why, it seems to be that the media has this obsession with kind of making him the face of these players wanting out of these places. He wasn't the only one, right? That's kind of my point here. And it's already been well documented, by the way, now as well. The fact that Blake Wheeler was the actual locker room problem, not Pierre-Luc Dubois. And so I won't rehash all of that here now. That's more of a conversation for a Winnipeg Jets podcast. But you can find this stuff if you look it up. It's out there. Blake Wheeler was the problem, not Pierre-Luc Dubois. But yeah, guys were asking out of Winnipeg left and right when Blake Wheeler was there. And, even now that he's not, it's still not exactly a hot spot to want to go and play, right? Or did you guys not hear about the Winnipeg Jets top prospect, Rutger McGroarty, asking out of there now too? He wants out now too. He hasn't even played a game there yet. So, it's not a Pierre-Luc Dubois problem is all I'm saying. It's very clearly a Winnipeg problem. And then we come to Pierre-Luc's time in Los Angeles, which he will be the first to tell you, right? That it did not go the way that he wanted it to. But I don't know if you guys heard, Kings general manager, Rob Blake, right? He actually just took full responsibility for why he thinks Pierre-Luc Dubois did not work out in Los Angeles. And it wasn't because of some sort of attitude problem. Rob Blake said just the other day that he thinks that acquiring Pierre-Luc Dubois was actually the wrong move for them right from the very beginning, just because of how their roster was already constructed, right? They didn't even really have a spot for him to begin with, to get the minutes or to be in the role that a player like that should be in. And you can certainly see that, clear as day when you look at Pierre-Luc's first and only season with the Kings, as plenty of times he was on the fourth line playing only 12 to 13 minutes a night. Pierre-Luc Dubois is a player who thrives and who has thrived in a bigger role, right? Playing more minutes, playing more important minutes, and that is exactly what you can see during his time in both Winnipeg and Columbus. Rob Blake, he admitted to the media that in all likelihood, it was likely his own fault that Pierre-Luc Dubois did not work out in Los Angeles. As he just said that, he never really fit because they didn't really have that role for him there available to put him in those spots to play those minutes. And he also said that, he felt that he didn't do a good enough job, or any job really, of integrating Pierre-Luc Dubois into their team in terms of, giving him a defined role or an expectation of, hey, this is what we want you to do, right? Every single player that you talk to will tell you that that is very important. Players want to know what the expectation is, what their role is. Every player wants to know that. It's very important. And when I listened back to Pierre-Luc Dubois' season-ending press conference from this past season with the Kings, because I listened back to the whole thing, and it was very interesting. That was actually, what I'm talking about here in terms of like with his role with the Los Angeles Kings. That was actually very, very evident in the questions that the reporters there were asking him, was that it seemed like even all of the reporters felt that Pierre-Luc was not given the proper role on the team. And they even referenced an interview that they had, I guess, done with him earlier in the season, where he kind of said, he said to the media and by extension to Kings fans, like, hey, look, I want to be better here. I want to play better. I'm not satisfied with my play here so far by any means, but I just feel like I need a little bit of help, a little bit of guidance, a little bit of coaching. He mentioned several times that like communication is very important, and that he just felt kind of, I guess, confused about what his role was supposed to be, or like what was supposed to be expected of him. Like, was he supposed to be this offensive player, playing on offense, getting on the forecheck, getting down to the offensive zone, or was he supposed to be like that two-way centerman or, defensive centerman? Like, he didn't really have any idea, it seemed, from Rob Blake when he was signed, or from the coaching staff thereafter, of what his role was supposed to be, or what was actually expected of him, right? So that was basically the gist of what he said, and the Los Angeles reporters seemed to agree with him, for what it's worth. So whether you think that is the general manager Rob Blake's fault for signing him in the first place when they didn't really have the room for him out there on the ice in their lineup, or, whether you think it's the fault of the Kings coaching staff for not finding him minutes, for not giving him a role, for not integrating him into the team, for not, coaching, for lack of a better word, or even whether you think it is ultimately the general manager's fault because the general manager hires the coach who is supposed to do the coaching, right? Whatever you think, whatever I think, whose ever fault it actually is, again, that's not our job or our problem on this podcast to try to figure that out now. That sounds like a job for an LA Kings podcast, or more likely something that general manager Rob Blake should answer to. But in any case, right, it probably doesn't matter now if you're a Capitals fan, because he's in Washington now with a whole new coaching staff, a coaching staff that proved in its first season that they are very much capable of getting the most out of their players. And so, to sum up, like, just to wrap this thing up here, because I'm sorry, you guys, I'm blabbering so much. I was just so excited to be here today, to come on here to do this podcast, because the off season is so long. And sometimes for like months at a time, there's precious little to talk about. But here, we get our first big trade of the off season. And so I was so stoked to come on and talk about it. And I am stoked as well to hear your guys' thoughts on the trade. Drop those in the comment section once you're finished listening, because I always love reading your guys' comments as well. But yeah, to wrap this up, the reason I don't mind betting on Spencer Carberry and the Capitals, league-wide, well-known, fantastic locker room culture to, so-called fix Pierre-Luc Dubois, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. But the reason I don't mind betting on that to happen is because, number one, we have a lot of salary cap space, like I said, and so we don't have to be concerned about the cap hit the way that some other teams would have to be concerned about the cap hit, right? Number two, even in Pierre-Luc Dubois' worst year, he still, like I said, would have been third on the caps in scoring last season. And number three, the alternative to this trade being made, the alternative had like disaster potential, right? And i.e., like, I'm talking about like trading away the types of young stud players and or prospects that it normally takes to acquire a top six forward. Because that's what it normally takes. Like I was hearing some things out there just from, I'm not talking about from any actual like connected sources. And General Manager Brian McClellan even said like he's not going to trade a Ryan Leonard. He's not going to trade an Ivan Miroshnichenko. He's not going to trade a Hendrix Lapierre. He's not going to trade a Connor McMichael. But just from some fans, I had seen like these crazy trade proposals of some of these, young stud players and prospects going out the door for whatever, insert top six forward here. Some 30-year-old top six forward, like that is not what we want here right now. That is not what we need to be doing. We need to be holding on to our young talent. We need to be continuing to develop them. We need to be continuing to be patient with them, waiting for them all to, come up to the Capitals, to get integrated into the Capitals, to start playing NHL games, getting used to the NHL game. And I want no part of that, like trading away young stud players or, stud prospects for like an aging, 30 something top six forward. Absolutely not. I want no part of that. But acquiring a young, 25-year-old top six forward, like a Pierre-Luc Dubois, without giving up any young players or prospects, that is always going to be considered a win. You can sign me up for that every time. And then you add in, like I said, that it gets rid of Darcy Kuemper's $5+ million to sit on the bench. And now it's absolutely a win, right? And I also love as well, by the way, that this does clear a path for one of Clay Stevenson or Hunter Shepard to the NHL, which the Caps needed to find a way to do, by the way, because they are the AHL's two best goaltenders. I do think that Hunter Shepard's got the inside track for next season, just due to the experience factor. He's a little bit older than Clay Stevenson, but I do think that long-term, in terms of like a bona fide NHL starter, that Clay Stevenson is going to be your guy. He just has all the makings of a goaltender that's going to be very successful at the NHL level. He actually looks like a future NHL stud, if I'm going to be quite honest with you. But yeah, I mean, Pierre-Luc Dubois, baby, big trade, gets the offseason for the Capitals off and running, off and flying. And to me, we have more than enough cap space, so it is very much worth taking a shot on a 25-year-old, fast, skilled, massive centerman who's third on your team in scoring on his worst days. And yeah, did we mention that he's 6'4", 225 pounds? Centermen like this do not grow on trees, folks, and certainly not centermen who are also this fast, this skilled, etc., etc., etc. So this has potential to be a massive coup for the Capitals, and the Caps under Brian McClellan have a history of succeeding with these types of quote-unquote project players. For God's sake, remember when nobody wanted Dylan Strome just 2 short years ago? Another young, big, skilled centerman. Another former 3rd overall pick as well, if you like symmetry and or if you believe in destiny. There's a lot of similarities there between a Dylan Strome and a Pierre-Luc Dubois. Even just like I said, in terms of them both being former 3rd overall picks, that's kind of weird. But yeah, nobody wanted Dylan Strome, right? Nobody wanted him. He was a so-called problem player, and no one other than Brian McClellan around the league had the foresight to see that, hey, I think there could be something really, really good here. And now we fast forward 2 years to now, right? And Stromer is coming off of back-to-back career seasons with our Washington Capitals. He was so good in his first season with the Caps that they signed him, of course, to that 5-year contract extension. And then he followed that up by besting all of the career high totals that he had just set in his first season with the Caps. He's a fan favorite now and a total gem of a player and a total gem of a human being. Beloved by absolutely everyone, and led the Washington Capitals in scoring last season, helping lead them back to the Stanley Cup playoffs. So look, all of this is to say, right, that just maybe we don't declare this guy, Pierre-Luc Dubois, a loser before he ever even plays a single game for our Washington Capitals, because things, like I said, are not always exactly as they seem. They weren't with Dylan Strome, and there's at least a pretty good chance that they won't be with Pierre-Luc Dubois either. Now, like I said, had we traded a stud young guy or a prospect for him, then we'd probably be having a totally different conversation. But thankfully we didn't, and we got Darcy Kuemper's contract off the books to boot. Kuemper being on the team last season probably cost us 5+ wins during that last season, I would say, based on his goals saved above or below expected, which when I checked at season's end, I believe the number was he was something like 78th out of 83 goalies who played in the NHL this past season, something like that. So that is no bueno at all. And getting him off of this team and out of our net will undoubtedly be addition by subtraction. But yeah, give Pierre-Luc Dubois a chance here, folks. That's all I'm asking for. Let's not write him off before he ever plays a game for our team. Let's not be those fans. Columbus, Winnipeg, like these aren't teams that are exactly known for having a good locker room culture, right? Like I mentioned, every Columbus player for the last decade plus is wanted out of there. Every Winnipeg player wanted out of there as well, until they finally got rid of Blake Wheeler. Hell, even like Paul Maurice, the head coach, even Paul Maurice wanted out of Winnipeg so badly that he resigned mid-season. And now, his first 2 seasons with his new team, he's gone to the Stanley Cup final twice and won the cup once, right? So all I'm saying is that things, like I said, are not always exactly as they seem. If Pierre-Luc had flopped in a place like, Boston or somewhere like that, then I would probably be, like I said, singing a different tune here. But given that at least 2 out of the 3 organizations that we're talking about here are known for having a shitty locker room before and after Pierre-Luc Dubois was ever there, I am willing to at least give the guy a fair shake before declaring him a pariah. Okay, that's all I'm saying. And hey, if he turns out to be a dick, I will be the first one in line to tell him so. All right, babes, that is going to do it for today's show. I do hope I was able to change some hearts and minds today. Let's give this a chance. Let's give this a shot. This has been the Jenaya Talks Caps podcast, hosted by me, Jenaya, the eternal optimist, apparently. Once again, if you guys enjoyed the show, I would love it so very much if you would click on that subscribe button. And as always, I appreciate each and every single one of you so much for listening to this show. If you've gotten this far into this long of an episode, then you are truly a real one, and I appreciate you so much. It has been a pleasure, babes, as it always is. And until next time, let's go Caps.